My parents kicked me out at 18 with nothing. 10 years later, they show up begging me to let them live with me. But I slammed the door just like they did to me. I'm 30 years old, I work in tech, making pretty good money, and I live in a 2-bedroom house that I bought on my own about 4 years ago. And when I say on my own, I mean literally on my own. No family help, no family loans, nothing. And the reason I mention this is because a few months ago my parents, Charles and Ruth, showed up at my door asking me to let them live with me because they're basically left with nothing. And I shut the door in their faces. I guess for a lot of people that sounds horrible. Like, how do you shut the door on your own parents when they're on the street? But the thing is, they did exactly the same thing to me when I was 18. And no, it wasn't because I got into drugs or stole or anything like that. They simply decided they didn't want the responsibility of having a daughter anymore. Let me go back a bit so you understand. I grew up in a house where I always felt like a burden. You know, like my existence was a constant inconvenience. My father worked in construction, made decent money, and my mother was a housewife, but not the warm maternal type you see in movies, more like the type who cleaned obsessively and made you feel like you dirtied everything just by existing. I don't remember either of them ever hugging me. I mean, I literally don't have a single memory of physical affection from them. Conversations at home were minimal, like just what was necessary to function, and they always had this energy of counting down the days until I left. My father was cold, very cold, and he had this way of looking at you like he was calculating how much you cost him. I remember when I was like 15 and needed school supplies, he gave me the money but made a comment that it came out of his pocket and that I should be more grateful. My mother, Ruth, was different but equally damaging because she did everything with this martyr attitude, like sighing loudly when she had to do something for me, or commenting that the laundry increased when I was home. They made me feel like every meal I ate, every shower I took, every light I turned on was an expense they deeply resented. The truth is, when my 18th birthday came, like 2 weeks after I graduated high school, I thought maybe things would change a little. I don't know. That maybe there'd be some recognition that I'd done things right, good grades, never got in trouble. I was basically the perfect daughter trying to earn their approval. But instead, my father called me into the living room where he and my mother were sitting on the couch, and he said, "Harper, you're an adult now and it's time for you to be independent. You have 1 month to find a job and a place to live." Just like that. No preamble, no real explanation. Just basically, we're washing our hands of you. Goodbye. I stood there unable to process what was happening, like my brain literally couldn't understand that my own parents were kicking me out. I tried to speak, say something like, "But I thought I could go to college. You said maybe I could live here while I studied." But my father just repeated, "You have 1 month?" And my mother didn't even look at me. She was sitting there with her hands in her lap looking out the window like the conversation wasn't about her. I asked them if I'd done something wrong, if we could talk about it. But my father got up and said the decision was made, and that they'd fulfilled their responsibility of raising me until 18, and now I had to fend for myself like all adults do. Those next 4 weeks were literally the worst of my life up to that point. I had no savings because they'd never let me work during school. They said my job was to study, but now it turns out they expected me to magically have the means to move out. I got a job at a grocery store, minimum wage, like $8.50 an hour or something, and started desperately looking for apartments. Everything I found was out of my reach. Until I finally found this horrible studio in a really bad part of town. $450 a month. And when I say horrible, I mean it had mold stains on the walls. The windows didn't close properly, and you could literally hear everything happening in the apartments next door. The day I left, and this is what gets to me the most even today, my parents said nothing. I packed my things, which weren't many because I didn't have much anyway, put everything in 2 suitcases and 3 boxes I found at the grocery store. And when I left, my father was watching TV and my mother was cleaning the kitchen, and neither of them turned to look at me. Not a goodbye, not a take care, not even eye contact. I closed the door and left, and I remember standing on the sidewalk with my stuff thinking, did this really just happen? Did they really just discard me like I was trash? The next few years were basically pure survival. I worked at the grocery store full-time, 8-hour shifts that sometimes extended to 10 or 11 when they needed me to stay, and I lived with literally the bare minimum. I ate a lot of rice, beans, cheap pasta. Sometimes a package of ramen had to last me 2 meals. I didn't have money to go out, to have fun, for anything that wasn't essential. and the heating in that studio was shit. So in winter, I basically lived wearing 3 hoodies, but I had this fire inside, this determination that I was going to make it just to prove to them, to myself, to the universe, that they weren't going to break me. At 19, I enrolled in community college, night classes because I worked during the day, and got a second job on weekends at a coffee shop. I slept like 4 or 5 hours a night, studied during work breaks, wrote essays at dawn, and basically became a machine for getting things done. I had no social life, zero, because I didn't have time or money for that. But I didn't really care because I was so focused on getting out of that hole that I didn't think about anything else. During all this time, my parents didn't contact me even once. Not a message, not a call, nothing. My Aunt Kimberly, my mother's sister, called me like 3 times in those years, asking how I was, and I'd tell her I was fine, even though it wasn't totally true. And she'd make these uncomfortable comments about how my parents mentioned I was doing well on my own, that I was very independent, as if they'd done something admirable by teaching me to be self-sufficient instead of literally abandoning me. I never told my aunt the full truth because, I don't know, I guess part of me was ashamed to admit my own parents didn't want me. At 21, I finished my associate degree, transferred to State University, and got a better job. Not much better, but at least $13 an hour. In an office doing administrative work. I moved to a slightly less horrible apartment. It had a real bedroom separate from the kitchen, the windows closed, there were no mold stains, and I felt like I'd won the lottery, even though it was still a pretty basic place. I continued with my routine of work and school, still 2 jobs, because university was expensive even with financial aid, and basically had no personal life until I graduated. When I was 24, I graduated with a degree in computer science. I'd taken every class I could on programming and technology because I saw that's where there were real opportunities to make money. And after like 50 applications and 20 interviews, I got my first real job at a tech company. $55,000 a year, and I couldn't believe someone was going to pay me that. Like it seemed like an absurd amount of money after living on less than $20,000 a year for 6 years. I could finally leave the shit jobs, rent a decent apartment, buy food without having to calculate every penny, and start breathing a little. 2 years later, when I was 26, I bought my house. It's small, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy but it's mine. And when I signed the papers, I literally cried in the notary's office because it was physical proof that I'd made it, that I'd built a life completely from scratch without anyone's help. I painted the walls myself, bought furniture little by little, planted flowers in the yard, and every single thing in that house I paid for with my own money, earned with my own effort. And then, like 8 months ago, when I was 28, my Aunt Kimberly called me. It was weird because she and I didn't talk much, like a message at Christmas and birthdays, and that's it. But this time she sounded nervous, and she told me she needed to tell me something about my parents. Turns out my father had made a horrible investment in a construction business with a partner who basically scammed him. They lost everything, had to sell their house to pay debts, and now they were living in their car, a 2015 Honda Accord with like 180,000 miles, moving between parking lots and friends' houses occasionally. My aunt told me she'd let them stay with her for like 2 weeks, but couldn't anymore because her husband was upset and her space was too small. And I was sitting there listening to all this thinking, and what does this have to do with me? That wasn't my immediate reaction to say it out loud, obviously, but it's what I was thinking. My aunt continued saying they were desperate, that my father had looked for work but at 60 with back problems nobody would hire him, that my mother, she was like 58, hadn't worked in decades and had no skills for today's job market, and that basically they needed help. I asked my aunt why she was telling me all this, and there was an uncomfortable silence before she said, "Well, Harper, you're their daughter, and I thought maybe you'd want to know." I'm going to be honest, I hung up that phone and felt nothing. Not pity, not guilt, not worry, absolutely nothing. I continued with my life, went to work, hung out with my friends because yes, by that point I had friends and a social life, watched shows, basically continued as if that conversation had never happened. Like 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning around 9 a.m., someone knocked on my door. I opened it, and there they were, Charles and Ruth, my parents who I hadn't seen in 10 years, standing at my entrance with 2 suitcases each, and this expression on their faces like they expected me to receive them with open arms. My father spoke first. said Harper. "We need to talk to you." And I just stood there at the door without inviting them in because, honestly, I didn't want them entering my house. I asked them what they wanted, and my father started with this speech about how they'd fallen on hard times, that they'd lost everything due to circumstances beyond their control, and that they needed a place to stay temporarily while they recovered financially. My mother was standing there nodding, and neither of them mentioned anything about kicking me out at 18, nothing about not having contacted me in a decade, nothing about the fact that they literally abandoned me. I told them, "You kicked me out when I was 18 with nothing. No help, no support. You left me to fend completely for myself. And now you want me to help you." And my father had the nerve to say, "That was different. You were young and needed to learn to be independent. We're older and don't have the same options." That answer made me so angry, like my blood was boiling. And I said, "No, you're not going to live here. You're not going to enter this house that I built without any help from you. You can leave." My mother started crying, something I'd never seen her do, saying, "Please, Harper, we're your parents. You can't leave us on the street." But I just repeated, "No," and closed the door. I stood on the other side of the door shaking, not from fear but from pure adrenaline, listening to them knock and knock, my father yelling that this was ridiculous, that I was ungrateful, that they'd raised and fed me for 18 years, and I just walked away and let them knock until they eventually left. I thought that would be the end of it, but oh no, that was just the beginning. The calls started, text messages, emails. They basically bombarded me with pleas and then with accusations of being a horrible, heartless daughter. Then they started recruiting family. My Aunt Kimberly called me saying I needed to reconsider, that they were my parents and family helps each other. My cousin Benjamin, who I barely knew, sent me a long message about family responsibility and karma. People who hadn't talked to me in years suddenly had very strong opinions about what I should do, and everyone, absolutely everyone, conveniently ignored the fact that my parents had abandoned me a decade earlier. Things escalated when, like 2 months after I shut the door on them, I received a legal document. Turns out my parents had hired a lawyer. You don't know how they paid for that, honestly, and were citing filial responsibility laws, basically laws that supposedly legally obligated me to support them because they'd supported me when I was a minor. The document was intimidating, full of legal language I didn't fully understand. But it threatened lawsuits and mandatory financial responsibility. I hired my own lawyer, which cost me like $3,000 that I really didn't want to spend, but I needed to protect myself. My lawyer reviewed the case, laughed, like literally laughed, and told me they had no real case. Apparently, those filial responsibility laws are almost never enforced, especially when there's evidence of parental abandonment, and the fact that they'd kicked me out at 18 and hadn't maintained contact for 10 years basically destroyed any argument they could have. My lawyer sent a response. Their lawyer must have seen they had nothing, because they never responded, and that legal threat disappeared as quickly as it came. After that, there was like a month of silence, and honestly, I thought they'd finally given up. But then I received a package in the mail. It had no return address, but I recognized my mother's handwriting on the label. Inside was an old photo of me when I was like 5, at the park, smiling at the camera, and a handwritten note from my mother that said, "Sorry for not being better parents. I know we don't deserve your help. We just wanted you to know we regret how things turned out." And that was it. They didn't ask for anything, didn't say where they were, just that short, ambiguous apology. I'm not going to lie, that affected me more than I wanted to admit. I sat with that photo and that note for hours, thinking about my whole childhood, about how they'd made me feel invisible and unwanted, about the years I spent struggling completely alone, about all the pain and loneliness and exhausting effort of building a life from nothing. And part of me, a small part, wondered if I should do something, help them in some way. But then I remembered how they'd shut the door on me, how they didn't care if I ended up on the street or went hungry or had nowhere to sleep, how they didn't even bother to say goodbye. I put the photo and note in a drawer and continued with my life. I didn't respond, didn't look for them, just continued. I blocked their numbers, blocked the family members who kept trying to mediate, and set clear boundaries with my aunt that I didn't want to talk about them. And you know what? I feel good about that decision. I don't feel guilt. I don't feel like I owe them anything. And I don't regret shutting the door on them. Now I'm 30. Still in my house. Still working in tech, making pretty good money, like $95,000 a year currently. I have a life I built completely with my own hands and my own effort. I go out with my friends, travel when I want to, buy what I need without having to calculate every penny, and I don't have anyone making me feel like I'm a burden. It's a quiet life. No family drama, no toxic people making me feel bad for existing. Sometimes I wonder where they are now, if they found help from someone else, if they're still living in the car. But those thoughts last like 5 seconds before I remind myself they made their choices and I made mine. I don't wish them harm. I don't wish them well either. I just don't think about them most of the time. And when people ask me about my parents, I say I have no contact with them and change the subject, because I don't owe anyone an explanation for why I chose to protect my peace. Last week, I was watering the flowers in my yard, the same ones I planted 4 years ago that are finally growing nice and full, and I thought about everything I've built. This house, this yard, this life. It's all mine. I made it all myself. And nobody can take it from me or make me feel like I don't deserve it. And that, I guess, is enough.